London, 1812. The chandeliers of Devonshire House shimmered like 1,000 captured stars, and the air was thick with perfume, laughter, and the sharp fragrance of envy. Beneath those vaulted ceilings, the season was in full bloom, another night of waltzes, whispers, and wagers made with glances rather than coin. Every woman in silk believed she might ascend. Every man believed he might conquer. And amid that glittering, perfumed battlefield sat Miss Angelina Smith, 24, in a gown a shade too pale and a year too old. She had attended 5 seasons, 5 long years of watching other girls plucked like roses, while she, too modestly rooted, wilted beneath their shadows. There was nothing grotesque about her. Her figure was gentle, her features refined, but her manner carried the faint melancholy of someone who had learned to fold her laughter small enough to fit into silence. The world did not despise her, it simply forgot she existed. And in London, that was the cruelest fate of all. The orchestra swelled. Couples turned beneath the chandeliers, all satin and bravado, the air bright with jewels and gossip. Angelina's fan trembled faintly in her hand. She smiled when spoken to and laughed at what she did not hear, as one learns to do when survival demands grace. A dowager murmured to another, "Poor Miss Smith, 5 years and still unclaimed. She will soon have to seek employment." The other tittered, folding her plump hands over a fan adorned with cherubs, perhaps as a companion to some lonely aunt, though I cannot imagine even the elderly seeking such quiet company. Their words brushed her like cold mist. She lowered her eyes, feigning interest in the orchestra. Across the floor, gentlemen moved like chess pieces, deliberate, strategic. They did not look her way. Angelina had stopped hoping years ago. Hope was expensive, and she could no longer afford it. A young lady named Beatrice Fielding, golden-haired and cruelly adored, leaned near with a smile too sharp to be kind. "Miss Smith," she said sweetly, "how noble of you to attend again this year. You give us all courage, truly, to see perseverance rewarded someday." Laughter rippled around the small circle of women. Angelina's lips curved faintly. "Perseverance," she replied softly, "is rarely rewarded, Miss Fielding, but it does keep one honest." The girl blinked, unsure if she had been insulted, and turned away. The small triumph warmed Angelina's chest for a single, flickering heartbeat. Then the music changed, a waltz, low and sweeping, the kind that made even cynics turn sentimental. Ladies fluttered like petals as partners were chosen. 100 gowns swayed, 100 promises made and broken in a single chord. No one came to her, not one. The narrator might have pitied her, but pity in such a room was indistinguishable from scorn. She rose once, as if to leave, then sat again. The wall behind her was cool against her shoulders. She had learned that marble was kinder than men's eyes. Her brother had stopped escorting her 2 seasons ago. Her mother's patience dissolved into quiet shame. Yet here she was, still smiling, still enduring, still wearing the ghost of what had once been faith. Then a hush. It spread slowly, a ripple through laughter and silk, until the orchestra itself faltered. The Regent entered the ballroom not with fanfare, but with gravity. The Duke of Hailworth had arrived. He was not young, though not old. His presence was carved from stillness rather than motion. The crowd seemed to tilt around him, as if the chandeliers bowed their light in deference. He was known by every name that carried warning: the Winter Duke, the broken husband, the duelist. His wife had died 3 years before, and rumor said he had killed the man responsible, though whether in honor or vengeance depended on who whispered it. Angelina's gaze lifted for reasons she could not name. He did not look toward her at first. He spoke briefly to the host, bowed to a duchess, refused a dance with a politeness that froze the air. Then inexplicably he turned. And in that crowded room of color and perfume, his eyes, gray, unreadable, found her. It was not the gaze of admiration. It was curiosity, sharp and assessing, the kind that stripped away pretense. She felt it like a touch. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. Around her, fans fluttered, voices buzzed. Who was he looking at? Her? Surely not her. He began to walk. Each step was deliberate, measured. like the slow toll of a clock marking the end of something long and tired. The crowd parted in silence. Her pulse echoed in her throat. She wanted to vanish, to become the wallpaper itself. Yet his gaze held hers, not cruelly, not kindly, but with the weight of recognition, as though he saw in her the same weary honesty he carried. When he stopped before her, the orchestra had stilled entirely. She rose instinctively, unsure whether to curtsy or flee. The Duke inclined his head, the smallest gesture, yet it silenced the world. "Miss Smith," he said, his voice low, precise, and curiously gentle. "Would you honor me with a dance?" It was a sentence London had not imagined would ever be spoken. Somewhere, a fan snapped in half. Angelina's lips parted, but no sound came. She searched his face for mockery, found none. Only quiet certainty. "Your Grace," she managed, "I fear." He extended his gloved hand. "Fear nothing, Miss Smith. Not tonight." The orchestra, uncertain, began again, a hesitant tremor of strings swelling into waltz. She placed her hand in his, barely daring to touch. The Duke guided her onto the floor. The first turn was awkward. She moved as one unaccustomed to being seen. But then his hand at her waist steadied her, his step deliberate and assured, leading her through the pattern with grave precision. 1,000 eyes watched, disbelieving. Her old tormentors stood frozen, the dowagers whispering behind fans. The Duchess of Waverly hissed, "He's gone mad." Yet in that sea of judgment, the pair moved as if in another world, her lavender gown brushing against his black coat, the candlelight catching on her lashes. "You do not often smile," he murmured, eyes not leaving hers. "I have not often been given reason," she whispered back. "Then let this be the first." The waltz slowed. The final notes trembled like a held breath. When it ended, he bowed, kissed her gloved hand, and said softly enough that only she could hear, "Thank you, Miss Smith. You dance as though you've nothing to prove, and that is rare." He turned and walked away, leaving silence in his wake. She stood motionless, heart unsteady, the room swimming in disbelief. 100 voices rose, laughter, speculation, the first cruel murmurs of scandal forming like frost upon glass. And yet, amid the clamor, one truth burned quietly within her. For the first time in 5 years, someone had seen her. Outside, the carriages clattered over wet cobblestones, echoing through the night. Inside, beneath 1,000 candles, Miss Angelina Smith exhaled, and the ballroom suddenly did not feel so cold. The Duke had crossed the floor for her, and London would not forgive it. Morning broke over London like a weary sigh, pale sunlight spilling through misted glass, and the distant rattle of carriage wheels echoing down Grosvenor Street. The events of the previous night still lingered in every drawing room, every tea room, every whispered conversation. The Duke danced with her, society breathed, as though the act had unstitched the laws of gravity. The forgotten Miss Smith. Angelina awoke before dawn, uncertain whether it had truly happened. Her hand still felt the ghost of his touch, that brief, steady warmth at her waist, his voice near her ear like a secret too heavy for daylight. But the city had already taken ownership of her story. By the time her maid entered with tea, a folded paper trembled in her hand. "Miss, it's in the Morning Gazette." The caricature stared back at her, cruel, inked mockery. A tall man drawn with exaggerated hauteur, leading a timid woman with drooping shoulders. Beneath it, the caption read, "The Duke and the Dowdy." Angelina's throat tightened. Beneath the jest lay a sharper cruelty, that she, by existing within his notice, had somehow insulted his rank. Her mother's voice pierced the stillness. "I warned you, Angelina. A man like that does not lift the invisible without reason." "I did not seek his attention, Mama." "Then why did you not decline him? You know what London makes a pity." Her mother's rings clinked against the teacup, her frustration poorly veiled by fear. For women like them, genteel but fading, reputation was the only inheritance left. Angelina folded the paper, pressing its corners flat. "Declining him would have made me cruel," she murmured. "Better cruel than ruined," her mother snapped, before sweeping from the room. That afternoon, the tongue convened at Lady Hollingby's garden party. The same women who had gasped and tittered in the ballroom, now eager to examine the specimen more closely. Angelina attended out of duty, her posture flawless, her smile a study calm. She had learned that the surest armor in London was composure. "Miss Smith." Beatrice Fielding's voice rang out, honeyed with false cheer. "How divine to see you. You must tell us how it felt, being chosen so unexpectedly." The surrounding ladies leaned forward like a bouquet of predatory flowers. "It felt," Angelina said evenly, "like a dance." "Oh, surely more than that," Beatrice laughed. "Did His Grace step upon your gown? He is not known for gentleness." "No," Angelina replied softly, "he was not unkind." The simplicity of her answer unsettled them. Cruelty expected resistance. Serenity offered no sport. Their smiles faltered. Yet later, when she passed the refreshment table, she heard her own name flutter from their lips again. Ambitious, manipulative, desperate. Each word a thorn she pretended not to feel. Meanwhile, in the Duke's townhouse on Brook Street, the same whispers reached a different ear. The butler laid the Gazette upon his desk, beside correspondence unopened. Hailworth read the caricature without visible reaction, though the faint tightening of his jaw betrayed something colder than amusement. His steward, uncertain, murmured, "Shall I issue a statement, Your Grace?" "No," Hailworth said. "Let them amuse themselves. Truth does not survive in print." He folded the paper once, then again, until the mocking figures vanished. Yet later, when evening settled and the city lights blinked awake, he found himself drawing open a small velvet case in his drawer, a single pressed violet resting within. He had found it days ago, caught in the lace of a lady's discarded glove at that same ballroom. The flower was fragile, unremarkable, and yet he had kept it. Now, without quite knowing why, he placed it within an ivory box and sent it out with no note. When the parcel arrived at the Smith residence the next morning, Angelina hesitated to open it. The paper was thick, the seal plain. Inside, the violet lay like a memory of gentleness. She touched its edges, wondering if it was apology or mockery. Her mother, upon discovering it, paled. "You must return this. Men of a station do not send tokens without consequence." Angelina wrapped the box again, intending to send it back. But when the footman came, she hesitated. The gesture had felt too quiet, too solemn to be jest. She kept it on her writing desk, unopened yet near, as though meaning might bloom from patience. Days turned to weeks. London feasted on the scandal, devouring and reinventing it. "He pities her," said one column. "He mocks her," said another. Invitations once abundant began to thin. Doors closed with polite excuses. Angelina endured it all with the composure of someone who had grown accustomed to silence. Until the second ball. It was held at the Lansdowne estate, vast, mirrored halls and fountains whispering in the courtyard. She entered late, her gown simple but luminous under candlelight, unaware that the Duke was already there. He stood apart, speaking little, his expression unreadable. The orchestra struck a familiar chord, a waltz, her waltz. When he approached, the room fell into the same awed hush as before. "Miss Smith," he said, voice even, but laced with something resolute, "you are unaccompanied?" "My brother refused to attend," she replied softly. "Then allow me to correct his error." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Again someone whispered, "He cannot mean to." Yet Hailworth extended his hand, and once more, propriety shattered beneath the weight of his calm. They moved together, the memory of the first dance guiding them. The music seemed slower this time, richer, as though aware of its own scandal. Angelina dared glance up at him. "You court censure, Your Grace," she murmured. "Censure is merely the noise of small hearts," he replied. "I have weathered worse." "And yet," she said, her voice trembling, "you risk your name for nothing." "Perhaps for nothing," he agreed, eyes steady, "or for honesty." The word lingered between them, fragile as the violet she had hidden in her drawer. When the dance ended, he bowed deeply, releasing her hand as though sealing a vow. "Good evening, Miss Smith." Then he turned and disappeared into the throng. That night, when she returned home, She found the ivory box open upon her desk. The violet was gone. In its place lay a folded slip of paper, inked in a hand she recognized instantly. "I never mock sincerity." The simplicity of it undid her. She read it again and again, the faint scent of pressed petals still clinging to the parchment. 1,000 questions bloomed and withered within her. Was it pity still, or something rarer? Respect? The city might call her foolish, but for the first time she did not feel so small. Outside, London slept beneath its own hypocrisies, but in a modest room lit by a single candle, Angelina smiled. Not the practiced smile she wore for society, but one that trembled with disbelief. For once, she was part of the story, not its subject. And as the flame guttered low, she whispered into the quiet, as though confessing to the dark itself. Then let them talk. In that defiant whisper, a heart-long silence stirred, and somewhere beyond the city roofs, a carriage rolled past into the fog, carrying a man who, for the first time in years, believed in sincerity too. Rain whispered against the window panes, a delicate percussion to the night's stillness. The season had slipped from gold to gray. Carriages now splashed through mud instead of glittering frost. For a month, London had thrived on a single narrative, that the Duke of Hailworth, the man most feared to love, had been ensnared by a woman too plain to be dangerous. Yet neither scandal nor silence could erase what had already been set in motion. Angelina Smith spent her evenings in quiet withdrawal, tending to her mother's failing nerves and her own threadbare dignity. Invitations no longer arrived. She no longer cared. Instead, she found herself rereading his brief message, "I never mock sincerity," until the ink grew faint from her fingers' touch. That single sentence lived within her like a pulse she could not still. When word came that Lady Godwin's charity gala would take place despite the storm, Angelina almost declined. But something restless in her, perhaps pride, perhaps defiance, urged her to go. She told herself it was duty, nothing more. Yet as her maid fastened the simple gown of deep blue silk, her heart betrayed her reasoning. The night was a tempest. Wind roared through the narrow streets, shaking the lamps until they flickered. Inside the grand estate, guests arrived drenched in gossip and diamonds, the scent of damp wool mingling with perfume. Angelina stepped inside the candlelit hall, her shawl clinging to her shoulders. She had scarcely greeted the hostess when lightning cracked across the glass dome above, plunging the room into a momentary darkness. A murmur rippled through the crowd, half laughter, half unease. And in that uncertain half-light, she saw him. The Duke stood near the far hearth, his coat darkened by rain, his expression grave yet composed. He was speaking to no one. The firelight carved his features into chiaroscuro, severity softened by weariness. Their eyes met, and the chaos of the room fell away. He inclined his head slightly, not as a noble greeting a subject, but as a man acknowledging an equal. For the first time, she did not look away. The evening stretched on, restless and imperfect. The storm worsened. Carriages could not depart. Ladies fanned themselves beside the fire, while the gentlemen muttered about roads turning to rivers. Amidst it all, Hailworth approached her with quiet inevitability, as though the room itself had bent to his will. "Miss Smith," he said, his voice a low anchor in the din, "it appears we are all prisoners of the weather." "I have known finer prisons," she replied, attempting levity. Her hand trembled around the teacup. He studied her for a moment, something like amusement ghosting his lips. "You endure mockery as if it were air," he murmured. "And you court it," she returned softly. "I cannot decide which is the greater folly. Perhaps we are both guilty of sincerity," he said, and there was warmth in his tone now, the faint, dangerous warmth of honesty. The candles fluttered. Rain lashed the windows. He gestured toward the smaller drawing room adjoining the hall. "Would you walk a moment? I promise no scandal, only shelter." She hesitated, knowing the peril of solitude, but the crowd's gaze felt heavier than his invitation. With a slow nod, she followed. Inside the drawing room, the fire burned low. The hush was complete save for the storm's rhythm against the glass. Shadows moved like dancers across the carpet. He stood before the mantel, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, and for a long moment neither spoke. The silence was not awkward, it was thick with meaning, as though both searched for words weighty enough to bear the truth. "Do you know," he said at last, eyes fixed on the fire, "that they call me heartless?" "I have heard the term applied," she admitted. "But then, London speaks cruelly of all who live differently." "Differently," he repeated, tasting the word. "I buried my wife 3 winters ago. The city said I grieved too little. When I withdrew, they said I brooded too much. One cannot win against a chorus that thrives on its own noise." His voice was low, roughened by memory. She wanted to speak, but sensed interruption would break the fragile confession. "She was beautiful," he continued, "but her beauty was a mirror that demanded admiration. I gave her devotion instead, and she despised me for it. When she died, they painted me the villain to make her perfect in memory." He turned toward her then, the light catching the faint line of exhaustion beneath his eyes. "I saw you, Miss Smith, sitting against that wall, not begging to be chosen, not performing delight, merely enduring. It was the first honest thing I had seen in years." Her throat constricted. "You mistake resignation for courage." "Do I?" he asked, stepping closer. "Then tell me, what kind of courage sits through 5 seasons of silence and still enters another ballroom?" His proximity unnerved her, his scent, clean linen, faint smoke, mingled with the storm's chill. "I suppose the kind that refuses to disappear," she whispered. The Duke's gaze softened. "Then I was right." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small folded handkerchief, within it a crushed violet, the same she had once hidden in the ivory box. "You kept the flower," he said. "I wondered if it would matter." It did. Her words trembled like the flame beside them, because it was the only thing sent without pity. He studied her, as though those words had struck something vital. "Miss Smith," he began quietly, "you think too little of yourself. And you, perhaps, think too highly of me." "Then we are both mistaken," he said. A pause, long and electric. The wind howled. She dared meet his gaze, unguarded, searching, alive. The world outside the window seemed distant, reduced to sound and color. "I am told," she said finally, "that you dance only with purpose." "Purpose can change," he replied. "Sometimes it is discovery, sometimes defiance." Their eyes held. A log cracked in the hearth, scattering sparks like fleeting stars. Neither moved closer, and yet the air felt drawn tight between them, as though touch had already occurred in thought alone. The housekeeper's voice echoed faintly down the corridor, summoning guests to supper. The spell broke. He stepped back, bowing with restraint that almost hid regret. "I have imposed long enough." "No," she said softly. "You have spoken truth, a rare intrusion in London." He smiled then, not the courteous curl society had memorized, but something unguarded and human. "Then let us both be guilty of it." He offered his arm, escorting her to the doorway. But before she could thank him, thunder cracked overhead, startling her into a step closer. His hand steadied her instinctively, fingers brushing her wrist. Neither spoke. The sound of rain filled the silence they could not break. When they reached the threshold, he released her with the faintest sigh. "Good night, Miss Smith." "Good night, Your Grace." He turned away, his coat disappearing into the corridor's candlelight. She stood alone, pulse wild, her reflection trembling faintly in the rain-dappled glass. Somewhere deep inside, she knew the city would twist tonight's moment into scandal. Yet beneath that fear stirred something greater, a fragile, terrifying hope. And as thunder rolled again, Angelina pressed her fingers to her wrist where his touch still lingered and whispered to herself, "So this is what it feels like to be seen." Spring arrived like a hesitant apology. Soft rain washing soot from the city stones, lilacs trembling in the wind, and London's gossip reborn with the first bloom. Yet not all things renewed. For Miss Angelina Smith, the world that had briefly warmed to possibility turned cold once more. The whispers that once amused the drawing rooms had curdled into cruelty. She ensnared him, they said now. She has designs. She plays the humble saint to trap a title. It began with a letter, unsigned, unkind, left at her mother's doorstep. Its ink bled through cheap paper, accusing her of deceit and ambition. By week's end, 3 others arrived. Servants gossiped. Neighbors avoided her mother at church. The same women who had once offered tepid smiles now turned away entirely. Scandal was not truth, it was hunger. It fed upon those too gentle to fight. Hailworth had gone to the continent, summoned by estate matters or perhaps by exile from gossip's reach. He sent no word. Weeks passed, then months. Silence deepened into absence, and absence into ache. Angelina told herself she had expected nothing, that their conversations had been courtesy, not confession. But every evening she found herself pausing by the window, eyes drawn to the street below, as though the night itself might deliver him. Her mother's health waned under the weight of humiliation. "We must leave London," she said weakly. "We are no longer received." Angelina's reply was steady but hollow. "If I flee now, they will believe every word they speak." Pride had never been her weapon, yet now it was all that kept her standing. One morning, she ventured to Hyde Park, the first time in weeks. The air smelled of wet grass and scandal. The fashionable hour had begun. Carriages lined the path like jeweled insects. She walked alone, bareheaded, her gloves slightly worn, her face lifted to the sunlight with defiant calm. Each glance that struck her felt like a lash, but she did not lower her gaze. Somewhere within, a voice, faint but resolute, whispered that shame only lived where one consented to it. As she crossed the Serpentine Bridge, the murmurs began. "There she is. How shameless. Alone again." The cruelty was not shouted, but woven through sighs and laughter, its refinement more venomous than vulgarity. She kept walking. Each step became an act of rebellion, her dignity drawn tight as silk stretched over flame. Then a sudden hush. Hooves slowed. A carriage, black and gleaming, stopped beside the railing. The door opened, and the world seemed to pause. The Duke of Hailworth stepped down. He was changed, tanner, sterner, as if distance had carved the last trace of gentility from his features. The murmurs turned to gasps. He did not glance at them. His eyes found only her. "Miss Smith," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the stunned quiet, "you walk early." "I find the air tolerable before it fills with judgment," she replied. He gave a faint smile, though his jaw remained tight. "And yet you brave it regardless. London will soon learn you are far less fragile than they pretend." A murmur of outrage fluttered through the crowd. "Your Grace," a matron whispered audibly, "you must not." He turned toward her, his gaze slicing through decorum. "Madam, I must." The matron paled. The air vibrated with disbelief. Angelina's composure trembled. "You should not be seen with me," she murmured. "They will think." "They already think," he interrupted. "Let them." Before she could retreat, he offered his arm, not discreetly, not with the shield of shadow, but beneath the bright, merciless daylight. "Walk with me," he said quietly. "If they must stare, let them see truth instead of rumor." Every instinct told her to refuse, yet his steadiness disarmed her. She took his arm. Gasps rippled like a wave. The orchestra of gossip fell silent. They walked together down the path, his stride measured, hers trembling. Each step rewrote something cruel in the city's memory. "I received your letters," he said after a long pause. "They were not mine," she replied. "I know," he said. "That is why I returned." She glanced at him, startled. "You came back because of lies?" "I came back because of how you endured them." His tone softened. "I have seen soldiers falter under less." They reached the edge of the park where willows trailed into water. "Why defend me?" she asked finally. "You owe me nothing." He stopped, turning toward her fully. "On the contrary, Miss Smith, I owe you gratitude. You reminded me that grace can survive cruelty." "I had forgotten." Her heart stuttered. Around them, society seethed in silence, their outrage palpable. The Duke lifted his head, addressing no one and everyone at once. "For months, you have made sport of a woman who sought neither fortune nor fame. You mistake your envy for virtue and her decency for deceit. I am weary of it." A duchess gasped. A gentleman muttered, "He's mad." But the Duke's voice only grew steadier, ringing clear through the morning air. "If scandal is the price of honesty, then let us be scandal itself." He offered his arm again, guiding her toward his carriage. The world seemed to tilt. Angelina felt every gaze upon her like sunlight too bright to bear. "Your Grace," she whispered, "you must not do this." "Must," he echoed softly. "London commands enough obedience. I prefer choice." When they reached the carriage, he paused, his expression unreadable. "I will escort you home," he said. "I cannot accept." "Then I shall walk beside you until you do." She stared at him, this impossible man, who had everything to lose and nothing to gain. "You will ruin yourself," she said. He smiled faintly. "Then we will be ruined together. I find the company agreeable." The words, so lightly spoken, carried the weight of defiance. She climbed into the carriage without another protest. As it rolled forward, the city blurred around them. Parasols frozen midair, mouths agape, scandal blooming like fire through dry grass. Inside, silence stretched fragile and intimate. "You should not have done that," she said at last. "No," he agreed, watching the rain streak across the glass. "But I wanted to." The carriage turned toward Mayfair, wheels cutting through puddles that mirrored the pale sky. She studied him in the reflection, the set of his jaw, the quiet certainty. "They will never forgive you," she murmured. "I did not ask forgiveness," he replied. "Only clarity." The word lingered between them, heavy and luminous. When they reached her door, he stepped out first and turned to offer his hand. For a heartbeat, neither moved. His gloved fingers brushed hers, a gesture both formal and electric. "London will howl," he said quietly. "Let it. You have more courage than all of them combined." Then, before she could answer, he lifted her hand and pressed it lightly to his lips, not as gallantry, but reverence. A simple act, yet it carried the thunder of rebellion. Every curtain in the square twitched. Every whisper began anew. But inside that single touch, the noise of the world seemed to vanish. He released her gently and stepped back, his voice low but certain. "This is only the beginning, Miss Smith." She stood motionless on the doorstep, the echo of his words trembling through her. For the first time, fear and hope felt indistinguishable. Above them, the church bells struck noon, clear, relentless, impossible to ignore. The final ball of the season began beneath a sky of pale gold, the kind that made even London's smoke seem almost tender. Inside the Duke of Hailworth's estate, light poured through tall windows onto polished marble and mirrored walls. Every chandelier burned brighter than propriety, as if daring the city to look away. Rumor had already rewritten the evening's purpose. They called it the Duke's Defiance. Every noble in England had come to witness whether his rebellion would end in ruin or redemption. Miss Angelina Smith arrived in a carriage borrowed from her cousin, her gown simple yet luminous, a pale lilac that caught the candlelight like dawn against stone. The streets leading to the Hailworth residence were crowded with curious faces, footmen whispering as she passed. Her heart thrummed like the strings of a harp pulled too tight. She had almost refused the invitation, thinking it a jest, but the handwriting had been unmistakable, elegant, measured. His. For once, come without fear. Inside, the orchestra was already playing. The air smelled of roses, wax, and the faint metallic scent of anticipation. Angelina paused beneath the archway, the murmur of conversation faltering as though the room itself had inhaled. She stood still, shoulders square, every gaze pressing like weight upon her. Then, from across the ballroom, she saw him. The Duke stood at the head of the hall, dressed in black, as if he mourned the hypocrisy surrounding him. His eyes met hers immediately. For a breath, the music thinned into silence. Then, with deliberate calm, he began to walk toward her. People parted. No one dared speak. The women leaned forward as if watching history tilt. The men watched with the fascination of those who secretly longed to defy, but never would. When he reached her, he bowed, low and formal. "Miss Smith," he said, voice soft yet carrying across the hush, "London has waited long enough. Will you dance with me again?" Her pulse fluttered. Every lesson of restraint she had ever learned faltered under the gravity of that moment. "Your Grace," she whispered, "they will not forgive this." He smiled faintly. "Then let them remember it instead." He extended his hand. Slowly, she placed hers upon it, trembling but unafraid. The orchestra resumed, a waltz, the same melody that had begun everything months ago. As they moved, the world seemed to draw inward, candlelight spinning around them like gold dust. The Duke's hand was steady at her back, his steps deliberate, protective. "You should not have called this ball," she said softly. "They think you mock them." "I do," he replied evenly. "I mock their fear." "And mine?" He looked down at her then, that quiet, piercing gaze that saw too much. "No, Miss Smith. Yours I honor." The words shook her more than the movement of the dance. She wanted to tell him she had no honor left to give, that the city had taken it in whispers and ink. But his hand tightened just slightly, as if answering a thought unspoken. Around them, the dancers resumed, but it was their waltz that commanded every gaze. When the final note faded, he did not bow. Instead, he spoke again, his voice calm, but his words carrying like a verdict. "There's something I wish to say before them all." She froze. "Don't." But he was already turning toward the crowd. Conversations collapsed into silence. He looked over them, men polished with arrogance, women glittering with disdain, and began. "You have built your world upon appearance," he said. "You worship elegance, mock sincerity, and call cruelty wit. For months you have slandered this lady with lies, not because she wronged you, but because her honesty revealed your own emptiness." A stir of outrage moved through the hall. Someone whispered, "He's lost his senses." But he went on, unflinching. "I have danced with countless women, smiled where I felt nothing, spoken where I should have been silent. And yet one woman, overlooked and unadorned, reminded me that dignity cannot be inherited, it must be lived." He turned toward her then, his voice softening. "Miss Smith, when I crossed the floor that night, I thought I offered you charity. Instead, I found grace." The crowd erupted, some in admiration, others in scandalized disbelief. Her heart pounded painfully. "Please," she whispered, "you must stop." "Not until you understand," he said. "I will not let the truth remain unsaid." He reached into his coat and drew out something small, the ivory box, now slightly worn from travel. Opening it, he revealed the crushed violet, faded but still whole. "You once told me this flower meant nothing. I disagreed then, and I disagree now. It has survived ridicule, distance, and time, as you have. And if you permit me, I would see it bloom again under my name." The room inhaled sharply. She could barely breathe. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice trembling, "you cannot." "I can," he said quietly, "and I do." Then, before the astonished assembly, he knelt. Gasps scattered like glass shattering. The orchestra faltered, candles quivering in their sconces. Angelina's world narrowed to the sight of that proud, impenetrable man kneeling before her, his hand still holding the faded violet like an oath. "I have no patience for London's judgment," he said softly, "but I will not stand for its hypocrisy either. I ask not for acceptance, only for truth. Marry me, Miss Smith, not to prove them wrong, but to prove that we still have courage enough to choose what is right." She stood frozen, tears stinging her eyes, though she did not yet understand if they were from fear or joy. The crowd murmured like a storm on the horizon, disbelief, envy, awe. Her entire life had been built upon silence, restraint, the art of being unnoticed. And now, under 1,000 candles, she was being asked to speak her heart before the world. "Your Grace," she whispered, "if I say yes, I will ruin you." He smiled, a trace of warmth breaking through solemnity. "Then ruin me beautifully." The laughter that followed from the crowd was uneasy. They did not know whether to mock or marvel. But Angelina, trembling, found that her shame had burned itself out. What remained was something fierce, almost holy. She took a single breath, and in that breath all her years of invisibility dissolved. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Your Grace." The words fell like bells striking midnight. The hall erupted, half in applause, half in outrage, but none of it mattered. Hailworth rose, took her hand, and drew her into a slow bow before them all. "Then let them write their gossip," he murmured, "for they cannot write our truth." Outside, rain began again, soft and cleansing. Inside, the orchestra resumed, the waltz swelling like a benediction. As they danced, her lilac skirts brushed the marble floor, his hand steady against her back, and the murmurs of London seemed to dissolve into music. When the final note lingered, he leaned close, voice barely a whisper. "The season ends tonight." "And what begins?" she asked, smiling through tears. He looked at her as if she were the first clear light after years of darkness. "Everything." The chandeliers flickered. The guests watched, some weeping, some seething, as the couple turned beneath a rain of gold light. Two figures in defiance of a city's cruelty. Their dance not rebellion but revelation. Outside, carriage wheels splashed through puddles, carrying the sound of distant bells across the sleeping city. And within that echo, one truth took hold and would not die. That in a world built upon masks, sincerity had found its throne again.